Thank you.
Is Robert S. Boynton, professor of journalism at New York University, Amos Camille, freelance journalist, and Philip Culhane, attorney at law. Okay, who's not here?
Mr. Culhane will be joining us.
Here he is. Thank you. Professor Boynton.
Dear Chairman Lentil and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Robert Boynton. I'm a professor of journalism at New York University, but I'm here because I was one of the founders of the Horace Mann Action Coalition. We established the group in the summer of 2012 after the New York Times Magazine published a cover story by Amos Camille revealing for the first time the rampant sexual abuse of children over several decades at Horace Mann. It is important to note that the school had not uncovered and made public a single episode of sexual abuse during this entire period. The goal of the Horace Mann Action Coalition is to encourage the school to deal forthrightly with this part of its past, to acknowledge officially that the abuse took place, apologize officially to the victims, and to participate fully in an independent investigation into how those abuses were able to occur. Horace Mann has so far refused to take any of these steps. Anything Horace Mann has done in the past 6 months to safeguard its students dates from that article, written by a freelance journalist with no access to or cooperation from the school. I would argue that New York State's restrictive statute of limitations is one of the reasons for the silence of the victims and for Horace Mann's ad hoc, clumsy response to the revelations. Without access to an orderly, legal process, both victims of sexual abuse and the institutions that harbored their abusers are left to flounder. For the victims, that can mean decades of psychological distress, substance abuse, and lost productivity. Meanwhile, the institutions have no clear path to confront the damage and to put the episodes behind them. Horace Mann will most likely end up paying settlements to the victims, but deprived of access to the legal system, the school may never rehabilitate its reputation. I'm also here to represent the alumni of a loose coalition of schools, Poly Prep and Yeshiva University High School here in New York, the Landmark School in Massachusetts, and others, whose administrators have also responded poorly to reports of sexual abuse. The similarities of what occurred in these schools, the abuse, the rationalizations for the behavior, the cover-ups, the years of shame and distress felt by the victims, is uncanny. The reason we have joined together is to underscore the fact that sexual abuse can take place at any school or institution. My colleagues and I are committed to this issue for reasons that are rooted in but go far beyond any individual school. I myself was not abused, but I studied with many of the teachers who were identified as abusers in the article, as well as several other teachers whose abuses have come to light since then. Both my sister and I attended Horace Mann, so learning that some of the teachers who had most profoundly and positively influenced us and had abused others was extremely disturbing. Far more disturbing was learning that many of my friends and acquaintances from Horace Mann had been abused. A friend with whom I attended both high school and college revealed that he had been molested by a gym teacher. In the 30 years plus since we left Horace Mann, he had never told anyone about the experience. Another acquaintance from Horace Mann's music program revealed that he had been abused by several of our teachers and had struggled with various forms of addiction ever since. In the absence of any public reckoning, both thought that they were the only ones these teachers had abused. You can imagine how this sense of isolation exacerbated the harm that was inflicted upon them in high school. Several others confided that they too had been molested, but didn't believe it would help them or their classmates to discuss it in public. After all, what could anyone do about it? A number of them had reported their abuse to various Horace Mann administrators while still students. In most cases, nothing was done. Having been rebuffed in their attempt to work through the school system, they can hardly be faulted for failing to pursue legal action before they turned the age of 23, as specified by this current statute of limitations. The taboo against discussing the sexual abuse of children in our society is almost as great as the taboo against sexual abuse itself. In fact, 1 out of 6 men and 1 out of 4 women have been sexually abused. The additional fact that one is less likely to be abused by a stranger than by a relative, neighbor, teacher, or religious guide goes against everything we want to believe about our world. It makes this knowledge almost unbearable. In my experience, people tend to recoil when they learn the above information. They resort to several varieties of denial. First, it's simply impossible that so many men and women were abused because if they had been, I would know about it. Second, they say or imply that anyone who actually was abused was probably partly responsible for it. Third, if they do acknowledge that sexual abuse in fact took place and was in fact unwanted, they argue that the victims, who seemed to be fine, probably weren't affected by it. And finally, they agree that if the abuse indeed affected them adversely, why then did they wait so long to tell anybody? You add to these rationalizations the last few. What can we do now anyway? Memories fade. There's no real evidence for us to evaluate. How will a trial or financial settlement really help the victims anyway? I've never heard so many arguments made by ostensibly well-educated people against learning more about terrible things that happened in the past. These people don't want to engage the issue because doing so is so painful. It reveals moral paradoxes and practical uncertainties. Much better not to talk about it and tell ourselves that a few seminars on abuse prevention will solve the problem. The question of why people wait so long to report their abuse brings up one of the most insidious parts of the phenomenon of childhood sexual abuse. As the earlier panelists have mentioned, study after study have shown that those who disclose their abuse, and it's important to remember that the majority of victims never do, are not able to do so until an estimated 30 years after the abuse. Why this is the case, I do not know. The fact that this delay occurs among victims of sexual abuse is so well known that any discussion of legislation such as Assemblywoman Markey's bill must address it. It may be inconvenient or embarrassing or perplexing or maddening or troubling, but it is a fact. And unfortunately, it is a fact that predators and the institutions that have harbored them are well aware of. For us to pretend otherwise is dishonest. Regardless of one's religious background, I think we all agree that human beings are fallen or flawed in some way. There will always be abusers in our midst, and they will always find ways to hurt the ones we love. And I say this as the father of a 9-year-old boy. Even after we take every precaution possible, such as open door policies, background checks, etc., some children will still be abused sexually in our schools and churches. The only thing we can do as a society is to address sexual abuse publicly. The perpetrators, not the victims, should be stigmatized. And that means passing and enforcing mandatory reporting laws, investigating episodes of abuse immediately and then publishing the results, and allowing the victims of abuse to seek legal redress. Most victims will never report their abuse. Those who do may not get very far in the legal system. But to curtail their access to the legal system, as New York State currently does, is essentially to deny them any possibility of justice. During the last 60 years, American society has rethought the legal status of African Americans, of women, and of gay people. Acknowledging the rights of those who were sexually abused as children to pursue justice is part of this unfolding American tradition. I hope that New York State will place itself on the right side of that history by recognizing these legal rights. Thank you.
Mr. Camille.